Hello friends, I'm Alex from The Last Climb, and today I'll go over the Kangchenjunga expedition where the Sherpas already knew this fraud was heading to his doom. His ego and arrogance, combined with his fraudulent resume, got him to attempt the death zone in the third highest peak in the world. But what ended up happening during that summit attempt was so shocking. Even veteran Sherpas were left absolutely horrified. It was late March 2018, and Kangchenjunga Base Camp sat at roughly 16,900 feet in far eastern Nepal. Kangchenjunga stood at 28,169 feet, the third highest mountain on Earth and among the least forgiving. The mountain had a fatality rate that exceeded Everest's by a pretty significant margin, and a reputation among experienced climbers as a peak that punished anything less than genuine competence. The spring season drew a small number of expeditions, roughly 12 climbers across 2 commercial teams, in a season that would offer one weather window and very little room for error. Among the climbers was Colton Merritt, 45, from San Diego, California. Colton ran an adventure lifestyle brand that had grown steadily over the previous 5 years through social media, speaking engagements, and outdoor industry sponsorships. His brand was built around the concept of elite alpinism as personal transformation, basically the idea that pushing into extreme environments made you a better leader, a better thinker, a better person. He had a polished website with professional photography, a podcast where he interviewed other climbers, and a speaking fee that put him in front of corporate audiences who wanted inspiration packaged as adventure. The mountaineering resume that supported this brand was impressive. 4 8,000er summits: Cho Oyu in 2013, Everest in 2016, Manaslu in 2016, and Broad Peak in 2017. Kangchenjunga was supposed to be number 5, the centerpiece of a new sponsorship cycle and the proof that Colton Merritt belonged among the elite. The problem was that most of the resume was a lie. Colton had legitimately summited Cho Oyu in 2013 with heavy Sherpa support on what is widely considered the most straightforward of the 14 8,000ers. He had also summited Amadablam and completed 2 7,000-meter peaks over the years. That was the real Colton Merritt. A competent trekker and moderate altitude climber who had one genuine 8,000-year summit to his name. Everything else was fabricated. On Everest in 2016, Colton turned around at approximately 27,200 feet during the summit push after his oxygen supply ran into problems and his pace collapsed. He descended to Camp 4, rested, and flew home. He told everyone he summited. The photos he posted were taken at roughly 27,000 feet in poor visibility, indistinguishable from summit photos to anyone who wasn't there. The Sherpas who worked that expedition knew he didn't summit, but Colton climbed with a large commercial operator where dozens of clients moved through in a single season. Nobody followed up. On Manaslu in 2016, he reached approximately 24,500 feet before altitude sickness forced a retreat to Camp 2. He claimed the summit from the comfort of base camp after the weather window closed and most other climbers had already left the mountain. Again, nobody checked. The Broad Peak claim was worse. Colton was never on Broad Peak. The summit, he claimed, belonged to a man named Travis Wynn, a legitimate climber from Portland who had summited Broad Peak via the normal route in the summer of 2017. Travis was 34 when he summited and had been climbing seriously since college, building his resume the way it was supposed to be built, one real mountain at a time. He and Colton had met through the climbing community and shared a single expedition together on Amadablam in 2014, where they spent 2 weeks at altitude, and Travis talked extensively about his plans for Broad Peak. Travis died in a car accident in late 2017, 5 months after his summit. Within months, Colton had incorporated Travis's Broad Peak summit into his own resume, using details from conversations they had shared, route descriptions Travis had told him personally, photos Travis had posted publicly, and the knowledge that the one person who could contradict him was no longer alive. The Broad Peak lie was what I genuinely cannot get past because it wasn't just fraud. It was stealing from a dead man's legacy, and the fact that Colton could do that and then stand in front of sponsors using Travis's story as his own pretty much tells you everything you need to know about this person and who he actually was. This fabricated resume is what Colton submitted to the expedition operator for Kangchenjunga. 4 8,000er summits made him a credible candidate for the third highest mountain in the world. The operator reviewed the application, cross-referenced the claimed summits against publicly available expedition records, and accepted him. The system for verifying summit claims on 8,000ers was basically loose enough that a determined liar could navigate it, and Colton had been building toward this moment for years. There was one additional element that would matter more than anything else on the mountain. Colton had publicly committed, through his sponsors and social media channels, to climbing Kangchenjunga without supplemental oxygen above Camp 4. His brand identity was built around what he called pure alpinism, basically the philosophy that the greatest mountains should be climbed without artificial assistance. On Cho Oyu, the only 8,000er he had actually summited, he used supplemental oxygen the entire way. But the oxygenless narrative was better for the brand, and by 2018 it had become kind of central to how sponsors valued him. The commitment had been announced months before departure, covered by outdoor media outlets, and discussed in a podcast episode that received more downloads than anything else he had produced. Walking it back was not a financial option. It was also not a survivable option on Kangchenjunga, a distinction Colton either did not understand or chose not to examine. Climbing Kangchenjunga without supplemental oxygen is something only a small number of elite climbers have ever accomplished. It requires years of progressive high-altitude exposure, exceptional cardiovascular genetics, and a level of physical preparation that borders on professional athletic training. Colton had none of these qualifications. The Sherpas who had worked oxygenless attempts knew immediately what the commitment meant for a client whose actual ceiling was somewhere around 27,000 feet with oxygen. Without it, the ceiling was significantly lower, and the consequences of exceeding it were not negotiable. His lead Sherpa was Nima Gyaltsen, 38, with 4 Kangchenjunga summits across 10 seasons. Nima was one of the most experienced guides on the mountain and had a quiet authority that came from having done the work so many times that nothing about the upper mountain surprised him anymore. He met Colton at base camp during the first week of April and formed an impression he later described as immediate and specific. Something about the way Colton handled equipment, the questions he asked, the gaps in his knowledge that a 4-summit climber just wouldn't have. Colton talked about his previous summits with confidence, but the details were occasionally wrong in ways that only someone who had been there would catch. Altitude slightly off, camp names confused, descriptions of terrain that didn't quite match. To most people, these would sound like minor memory lapses. To Nima, they sounded like someone describing a trip they had read about rather than taken. The second Sherpa assigned to Colton was Mingma Dorje, 26, in his 3rd Kangchenjunga season. Mingma was the first to say it out loud. 2 days into acclimatization, he told Nima privately that Colton's movement on moderate terrain did not match anyone who had been above 26,000 feet, let alone someone who claimed 4 summits. He moved like a strong trekker, not like a high-altitude climber. The difference, Mingma said, was something you either recognized or you didn't, and once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Mingma saying it out loud is kind of the moment the whole thing shifts for me, because the Sherpas aren't guessing anymore. They know. And the question stops being, is this guy for real? And starts being, what happens when the mountain finds out he's not? Nima had additional information. A Sherpa named Lakpa, who had worked the 2016 Everest season, told Nima months earlier that a client matching Colton's description had turned around well below the summit and later claimed it publicly. Lakpa remembered the specific expedition and the specific client because the discrepancy had been discussed among the Sherpa team at the time, but never reported. When Nima saw Colton's name on the Kangchenjunga roster, he connected the accounts. Acclimatization began in early April with rotations to Camp 1 at roughly 20,000 feet and Camp 2 at roughly 21,300 feet. Colton performed adequately on the lower rotations, his genuine experience on Cho Oyu and Ama Dablam providing enough baseline fitness to handle moderate altitude. But the margins were thinner than they should have been for someone with 4 8,000er summits. His pace was inconsistent, his appetite diminished earlier than expected, his recovery between rotations was slower than Nima had seen from climbers with comparable claimed experience. experience. On the descent from Camp 2, he stumbled twice on terrain that was technically simple, catching himself on the fixed rope both times. Nima noted each incident without comment. Kyle, a climber from another team who had summited Lhotse the previous year, later told a journalist that he had watched Colton during the Camp 2 rotation and assumed he was a first-time high-altitude client. When told Colton claimed 4 8,000er summits, the guy was genuinely surprised. The rotation to Camp 3 at roughly 24,300 feet exposed the gap more clearly. Colton arrived at camp visibly depleted, his breathing labored, his coordination noticeably reduced. He slept poorly, ate almost nothing, and complained of a persistent headache he attributed to dehydration. The following morning, he moved with the heavy, unfocused quality that Nima associated with climbers who were approaching their physiological ceiling. He fumbled a crampon strap adjustment that should have taken seconds and needed Mingma's help to secure it properly. For a man who claimed to have summited Everest at 29,032 feet, struggling this much at 24,300 was a signal Nima could not ignore. A genuine four-summit climber at this altitude would be uncomfortable but functional. Colton looked like someone encountering a new personal limit. What got me about reading through the acclimatization accounts is that the mountain was basically giving Colton every possible warning, and he treated each one like a temporary inconvenience, rather than the clear message it was. And Nima could see it happening in real time, but couldn't force a man to hear what he didn't want to hear. Nima raised his concerns with the expedition leader after the Camp 3 rotation. He stated directly that Colton's performance did not match his application, and that in his professional judgment, the client was not qualified for a Kangchenjunga summit attempt. The expedition leader reviewed Colton's paperwork, noted the 4 claimed 8,000er summits, and told Nima that performance at Camp 3 was not necessarily predictive of summit day capability. Some clients had slow acclimatization rotations and strong summit pushes. Nima disagreed, but the decision was made. Separately, Nima attempted to verify the Broad Peak claim. He contacted a Sherpa who had worked Broad Peak expeditions in 2017. The Sherpa could not confirm Colton's presence on any team that season. When Nima searched for Travis Wynn online, he found an obituary dated November 2017 and a Broad Peak summit entry from the same year. The connection between Travis's real summit and Colton's claimed summit became pretty clear, though Nima could not prove it definitively from base camp. He reported his findings to the expedition leader. The leader said it was not enough to remove a paying client from the expedition. The Sherpas being ignored by the operator is honestly the part that makes this whole thing feel systemic to me. Because it's not like they were vaguely worried. Nima basically laid out a case that this man should not be on the mountain. And the response was essentially his check cleared. So we continue, and that dynamic between the people who know and the people who profit is kind of the entire problem with commercial high altitude climbing. Over the following weeks, Colton rested at base camp and recovered some of his strength. His confidence, which seemed to operate independently of his physical condition, came back. He talked about the summit push in interviews with a small media crew that was documenting the expedition for his sponsors. He discussed the oxygenless strategy as a philosophy rather than a logistical choice, framing it as basically a spiritual commitment to experiencing the mountain on its own terms. Nima noticed that Colton moved and spoke differently when the camera crew was filming. His posture straightened, his breathing steadied, his language became polished. When the cameras packed up and it was just him and the Sherpas, the performance dropped and the exhaustion underneath became visible again. Mingma told Nima it was like watching two different people alternate depending on who was in the tent. Nima and Mingma prepared oxygen bottles for the summit push regardless. Experienced Sherpas always carried backup systems. They packed 2 backup bottles, enough to sustain Colton through a descent if he accepted it. The weather window opened on May 19th. Forecasts showed conditions holding through the 21st before wind returned. The team rested at high camp through the afternoon of the 19th, checking gear, hydrating, going through the pre-summit routine that Nima had done dozens of times. Colton was energized, talking about the summit with the confidence he always projected regardless of circumstance. Nima watched him pack his summit bag and noticed small errors in gear organization, the kind of inefficiencies a four-summit climber would have resolved seasons ago. He said nothing. The time for warnings had passed. They departed high camp at approximately 25,600 feet shortly after midnight on May 20th. Temperatures were around minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit with light wind. Two other teams departed within the same hour. Roughly 8 climbers total, moving upward in the pre-dawn darkness. Above Camp 4, Colton was climbing without supplemental oxygen. Nima and Mingma carried their own supply, plus the backup bottles for Colton. The first 2 hours above high camp went poorly. Without supplemental oxygen at roughly 26,000 feet, Colton's pace dropped to a crawl. His breathing was audible from 20 feet away, each inhale a visible effort that consumed energy the climb demanded elsewhere. Nima had seen oxygenless climbers before, legitimate ones who had trained specifically for the physiological demands, and they moved nothing like Colton. Genuine oxygenless climbers at this altitude were slow but steady, their bodies adapted through years of progressive exposure. Colton was simply suffocating incrementally, his body consuming itself to compensate for what the missing oxygen should have provided. By approximately 26,800 feet, Colton's motor function had begun deteriorating. His crampon placements were imprecise, his balance on the fixed rope unsteady, his responses to instructions from Nima arriving several seconds late. Two climbers from the other team passed them on the fixed rope during this stretch, moving at roughly twice Colton's pace. One of them glanced at Nima as he passed, and Nima later said the look communicated everything without a word being exchanged. Nima stopped on the route and told Colton directly that he needed to begin using supplemental oxygen or they needed to turn around immediately. There was no third option at this altitude. Colton refused. He said he was managing the pace and that the summit was achievable. Nima told him it was not. Colton continued climbing. Nima carrying those oxygen bottles up the mountain knowing Colton would probably refuse them is something I keep circling back to because it's basically the entire tragedy in one image. The solution was right there on Nima's back, and the only thing standing between Colton and survival was Colton's refusal to admit that the persona he built was never real. Above 27,000 feet, the deterioration accelerated. Colton's cognitive function declined visibly. His speech became repetitive, cycling through fragments of motivational language from his speaking engagements. Phrases about commitment and pushing through that had no connection to the reality unfolding on the ridge. Mingma recognized the pattern as early-stage haze, the brain swelling that altitude produces when the body can no longer compensate. At approximately 27,200 feet, Nima stopped Colton on the fixed rope and physically held an oxygen mask toward his face. He told Colton clearly that without oxygen, he would die on this ridge. Colton pushed the mask away. Mingma tried from the other side. Colton turned his head and continued trying to climb. The next 30 minutes were the longest of Nima's career. He and Mingma followed Colton as he moved at barely perceptible speed along the ridge, his body swaying against the fixed rope, his hands gripping without apparent purpose, his eyes open but increasingly disconnected from the terrain around him. Twice he stopped and stood motionless for several minutes before resuming movement that no longer resembled climbing. Nima offered oxygen 3 more times. Each time Colton either waved it away or did not respond at all. At approximately 27,400 feet, Colton's legs buckled and he collapsed onto the fixed line, his full weight dropping onto his harness. Nima and Mingma reached him within seconds. They forced the oxygen mask onto his face and opened the regulator to full flow. Colton did not resist because he was no longer capable of resistance. His breathing was shallow and irregular, his responses to voice and touch absent. The oxygen that could have prevented this outcome hours earlier now flowed into a body where both cerebral and pulmonary edema had progressed beyond what late intervention could reverse. The hardest part for me to sit with is that the oxygen genuinely seemed to work for about 10 minutes. His breathing stabilized slightly and his eyes opened partway. And for a moment, Nima thought they might be able to get him down, and then his pupils stopped responding and that window closed, and that moment of almost saving him is somehow worse than if the oxygen had never worked at all. Nima and Mingma attempted to lower Colton down the fixed rope, but he had become completely unresponsive. Dead weight lowering a full-grown man down steep terrain at 27,000 feet was not physically possible with 2 people at that altitude. They secured him to the fixed line with multiple anchors and retreated to high camp to organize a larger rescue team. By the time 4 additional Sherpas reached Colton's position the following morning, he had been exposed at 27,400 feet for over 12 hours, in temperatures that dropped well below -30 Fahrenheit overnight. Colton Merritt was 45 years old. He died roughly 770 feet below the summit of the 3rd highest mountain on Earth, with full oxygen bottles within arm's reach that he had refused to use. In the weeks following the expedition, the investigation into Colton's resume began with Nima's formal statement to the expedition operator. Nima detailed his observations from acclimatization, his prior knowledge from the 2016 Everest Sherpas, and his research into the Broad Peak claim. The operator launched an internal review. The Broad Peak fraud was confirmed first. Travis Wynn's family, contacted by a climbing journalist following up on Nima's account, confirmed that Travis had summited Broad Peak in 2017 and that Colton had never been part of that expedition. The photos Colton had used in his resume and on his social media were identified as Travis's. The family issued a public statement expressing devastation that their son's achievement had been stolen by someone who used it to put himself on a mountain he had no business being on. The Everest fraud was confirmed through Sherpa testimony from the 2016 season. Multiple support staff recalled Colton's turnaround and subsequent false summit claim. One Sherpa confirmed the exact altitude at which Colton had turned around and recalled a conversation in which Colton discussed his intention to claim the summit regardless. The Manaslu fraud was confirmed through expedition records showing that Colton's listed summit date didn't correspond to any successful summit push during the 2016 autumn season. The operator who ran the Manaslu expedition confirmed that Colton had retreated to Camp 2 and left base camp before the weather window even opened. The sponsor who had funded the Kangchenjunga expedition and the oxygenless angle quietly terminated their partnership and removed all content featuring Colton from their platforms. The speaking agency canceled his remaining engagements. The podcast went dark. The website was taken offline within months. The entire infrastructure of the persona Colton had spent 5 years building collapsed in basically the same amount of time it took the climbing community to verify what Nima had been saying since April. What came out about Travis's family having to deal with the Broad Peak lie on top of already losing their son honestly broke something in me covering this, because the fraud didn't just kill Colton. It reached backward and hurt people who had nothing to do with any of it. And that's the part that makes this story different from most of the others I've covered. Of Colton's 4 claimed 8,000er summits, only Cho Oyu was legitimate. The resume that qualified him for Kangchenjunga was built almost entirely on fabrication. The oxygenless commitment that killed him was built on a brand identity that required the fraud to continue. And the system that was supposed to prevent unqualified climbers from reaching the death zone failed because it was basically designed to verify paperwork, not competence. Nima Gyaltsen returned to Kangchenjunga the following season. He told a journalist that the thing he carried from the Merritt expedition was not grief or guilt, but frustration, because he had done everything a guide could do short of physically dragging a client off the mountain, and it had not been enough. He also said the experience had changed how he evaluated clients, that he now trusted his own instincts over paperwork and would refuse to guide anyone whose body didn't match their resume, regardless of what the operator said. Mingma Dorje completed the season but requested reassignment to trekking operations for the following year. He said the weight of watching someone choose a lie over their own life was not something he wanted to carry to another summit. Colton Merritt was 45. He had one real 8,000er summit to his name. He died on the 3rd highest mountain in the world because the person he pretended to be could climb Kangchenjunga without oxygen, and the person he actually was could not. The fraud didn't just get him onto the mountain, it trapped him there. Every lie he told since 2016 built the cage a little higher and a little tighter, until the only way out was admitting none of it was real, and he would rather die on the ridge than say that out loud.